We start with these protests spreading rapidly and intensely across China. Thousands of demonstrators are angry with COVID lockdowns, many of them calling for democracy and political freedoms and an end to President Xi Jinping's regime. Police have responded to the unrest with brutality, chaotic scenes of protesters being dragged, shoved, and beaten. Take a look at BBC reporter Ed Lawrence being taken into custody in Shanghai. Again, that is a journalist. Look what police are doing to him, taking him into custody. The BBC, the outlet he works for, says that Lawrence was kicked and handcuffed for hours before being released. Selena Wang is live in Beijing for CNN this morning. Selena, thank you for your reporting on this throughout. This is deeply personal to so many in China. How different is this from what we've seen, at least in the last decade or so? It seems like this time is different.
This is unprecedented since Xi Jinping took power. What we are seeing is surreal and unbelievable. Last night, I was there in the middle of a protest in the capital of China. We're talking about a country where it is extremely dangerous to publicly criticize the party, especially Xi himself. You risk prison time or even worse, but that is exactly the risk people are taking across the country. And last night in Beijing, they were chanting over and over again, "We don't want COVID tests. We want freedom." Some shouting for freedom of speech, human rights. Many people also holding white papers in their hands. It's a sign of solidarity against censorship. And I spoke to a protester who told me he motorcycled and biked more than an hour to get to the scene. And when I asked him how he was feeling, this is what he told me.
I'm overwhelmed. Every conscientious Chinese should be here. They don't have to voice their opinions, but I hope they can stand with us.
And I cannot overemphasize how rare it is to have someone speak to CNN maskless in public. It shows just how determined they are for their voices to be heard. And after 2 a.m., more masses of police filed in. They were forcing us to disperse. We saw those videos of violence in Shanghai during the protests, but at least what I witnessed yesterday was peaceful.
Listen, it is very dangerous. They're obviously putting their safety and their lives on the line there. And, you know, Poppy asked the question, you know, what happened this time? But do you think that this will be effective this time?
While these people are extremely determined, but this is also extremely dangerous, and the security presence is huge. I'm about to drive out right after this to go back to the place where we were, and I'm expecting to see rows of police cars there. But what pushed people past their breaking point this point, Dawn, was so heartbreaking. It was a fire that broke out in the far west region of Xinjiang that killed at least 10 people, and videos of the scene indicated that COVID restrictions prevented victims from getting help, with the compound entrance blocked by these fences and metal barriers normally used in COVID lockdowns. You can literally see flames coming from the building, no water able to reach them. It triggered people's worst nightmares, Dawn. The idea that any one of us could be trapped in a building while a fire is raging, unable to get help, Dawn.
Selena Wang, thank you very much for that.
For more on this, I want to bring in CNN anchor and chief national security correspondent Jim Sciutto, who is in Washington. Jim, there have been signs of dissent, but do you think that this new wave of anger is posing a bigger challenge for Xi Jinping's government?
It is definitely posing a challenge to the government. The question is how big of a challenge, because this is a government that has built a security apparatus over 2 decades precisely to control this kind of thing. But let's look at the scale of this, right? The protests happen in China. It's a country of more than 1.5 billion people, but those are local. This is national, and it is affecting China's biggest, most powerful cities. Of course, the capital, Beijing, Shanghai Business Center, Guangzhou in the south, Nanjing, Wuhan, Chongqing, Chengdu. These are cities of tens of millions of people in many cases. And when you look at the protests, they're not small and isolated. They are often involving hundreds of people out in public places, as Selena mentioned, with their masks off, allows them to be easily identified. And that is an act of courage in this country, because this is a country that tracks every act of dissent. It knows who you are, and it punishes those people. It's an enormous risk to do what these people are doing to challenge the government. And this is something that Xi Jinping is certainly noticing. They are not just saying, I have a problem with China's COVID policy. They are mentioning Xi Jinping by name, and they are mentioning freedoms by name. Listen to this particular point. This is in Guangzhou in the south. Listen to what the protesters are saying here. We'll play the clip. They're saying no to lockdowns, yes to freedoms. They mention freedom of the press. They mention freedom of speech. They mention freedom of action. These are things explicitly forbidden in China, Caitlin.
Yeah.
And that is a much broader criticism than just saying we're sick of the COVID restrictions.
Yeah, and this comes as, Xi has just gotten his third term in power. I wonder how the government, what are you watching to see and how the government is responding to these separate factions and protests all coming together under this pushing back against the COVID restrictions?
It's a good question, and they are responding by tweaking. We already heard today, and Selena Wang mentioned this. This is the moment that really sparked all this. This is Urumqi. You have a fire in an apartment building. There's the fire hose. The reason the firemen could not get to the building is because of the COVID restrictions. There were barriers around the building, so they're so far away the water can't even reach the flames, right? This led to the frustration here. They have since tweaked some of those policies, no longer, for instance, locking the doors to apartment complexes, so in the event of a fire, say, firemen can get in there, but those are tweaks. They had just relaxed COVID policies earlier this month, but then when the COVID cases went up again, they had to reimpose many of those restrictions there. And to this point, Caitlin, China's COVID policy is a failure. Their vaccines largely don't work. People are still getting infected. And there was one moment, I've been told, Caitlin, that has been particularly powerful for the Chinese people. They've been watching the World Cup, okay? Like the world is watching the World Cup. They see maskless crowds in Qatar cheering for their teams. China's still behind masks. And it's not just the developed world, but developing world that seems to have put COVID behind it. China has not, and that's causing enormous frustration there. The trouble is, China has an enormous security apparatus.
Yeah.
They will crack down, and they'll crack down hard.
Yeah, we'll be watching. Jim Sciutto, thank you.
These protests are a glimpse of the Chinese people standing up to the communist government and daring to openly call for the removal of Chinese leader Xi Jinping. Here's why some experts say that is unusual.
China has often allowed protests. People have the mistaken impression that they allow no protests. There are lots of protests. They're always on very specific local issues, food shortage or local corruption, something like that. What is extraordinary about this one is that they are allowing protests in which people are talking more generally about Communist Party rule, as you say, no to COVID lockdowns, yes to freedom. There have even been some of those Shanghai protesters who have said, Xi Jinping resign, things like that. That is completely unusual. It is unprecedented. And for it to be happening in Shanghai at Tsinghua University, the university that Xi Jinping went to when he got his chemical engineering degree in the 70s. That is what makes this quite unusual.
In China, I really doubt that we've got a situation whereby you're going to see sort of an overthrow of the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese leadership. The Chinese security services, like all intelligence services in authoritarian countries, spend a lot of time trying to penetrate, get inside these groups so that they can have spies inside to know what they're up to. So it's a difficult balancing act, but I don't think we're going to see the collapse of the Chinese government anytime soon.
The public protests and news of rising COVID cases have rattled the financial markets. In Monday's early trading, both the Shanghai Composite and the Hang Seng took major blows, and the Chinese yuan also plunged against the US dollar.